Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Eric Hewson, and these are the Same Here, Hear Us Out episodes. This is episode number 3 right now. Again, a little bit of background on how these came together. Overseeing a nonprofit organization that's called the Same Here Global Mental Health Movement. The idea behind that from a mental health perspective is to look not as the sick people and the healthy people, but look at it more as a collaboration and a combination of all the people that live in this world on a mental health continuum and sharing the similarities that we have as opposed to the differences. And so, with so much going on from a current event standpoint as it relates to social justice, and so many of our friends talking and folks that we collaborate with speaking, and seeing some of the divides that exist, some of them on a political perspective, some of them on a social perspective. The idea was, let's actually get together and discuss these topics. Let's dive deeper into talking about them in ways other than just on social media, tweets, shouting at one another, even out in the streets with protests. You have some groups shouting one thing, other groups shouting another thing. Can we really dive deeper into this and talk about the similarities that we have more than the differences? And so, back again, as we've had in the past, is Don Povia from Transition Sports and Entertainment and the Outside Game. So Don, hello. I guess consider my co-host at this point.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm still here. Sorry.
I haven't chased you off yet.
Not yet.
And then a gentleman that I became friends with, what is about 2.5 years ago now, maybe even a little bit longer than that, a gentleman named Lenny Carter, who's just doing awesome things in the mental health space. Going to ask him in a bit to share his personal background because I think that's going to be really relevant and helpful to this conversation. But Lenny and I became friendly just both being in that mental health space. I come at it from the nonprofit perspective. Lenny comes at it from the perspective of trying to help bridge the gap between folks looking for service and the providers themselves with a company that he has that's called True Circle, which is a real strong need right now in this space where it's really hard to find the right type of help when we're going through challenges. And so we're going to continue the conversation. We'll get into some specific questions. I teased some of those conversations when I did the post a little bit earlier today. And so we'll be diving into those topics and more. So Lenny, welcome, number one.
Thank you.
And number two, I just love hearing you speak because I think you're a great speaker and you're very motivational, inspirational. But if you give a little background on growing up, I know the Brownsville, Brooklyn background, I think that'd be so helpful for everyone who's listening.
Absolutely. I grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, New York, at a time where Brooklyn was going through a rough time in these underserved communities where drug abuse, crime, violence was a lot due to the crack epidemic. The streets were flooded with crack in the mid 80s to really, cause people to not understand this unique high that was going on and causing an addiction that caused these crime rates and issues to occur. So growing up, seeing that as a child, I had to challenge myself. I took a lot of pride into my schoolwork because, seeing the things I was seeing in my community wasn't fun. And the attaboys or the good jobs would come from me getting good grades at school. So I poured my kind of energy and attention into that. And that afforded me the opportunity to go to college, which unfortunately a lot of people from my neighborhood didn't. So earning my degrees, a bachelor's in business, master's in human resources, I learned really quickly in corporate America, my master's is in human resources, that I had to wait till someone died or retired for me to move up, especially even being a Black man in human resources, which is typically uncommon. Not only is it a female typical role, but a role that is also ran by people of other cultures. So from that, I moved on into entrepreneurship and worked in tech, building websites for restaurants for 10 years, 2006 to 2016. And I had a blast doing it, coming on board, joining a company that I had two good friends that founded it, and becoming an equity partner led us to having over 60 employees, helping thousands of restaurants throughout the nation, and eventually getting noticed and getting acquired. But during that journey was the key element that pushed me into the mental health space. That entrepreneurial journey wasn't only heavy as an entrepreneur, because any entrepreneur that's either tried it or still working on it understand that it comes in ebbs and flows. You have your good days, you question whether or not you're doing the right thing, whether or not entrepreneurship is for you. So along with the entrepreneurial battle, right away, a year or two into entrepreneurship, I lost my mom. She was only 53 years old, coming home from work on a subway platform where she fainted and hit her head. I was in my 20s. She was in ICU for 2 weeks. And I was there at the hospital really battling my own struggles of life's purpose and what does this mean, and you know, struggling essentially with my mental and emotional health. Unfortunately, she passed after 2 weeks in ICU, and through that, it put me deeper into depression. You know, I struggled more. I had suicidal ideations where it was just like, what is my purpose for living? Where do I go from here? And if it wasn't for a loved one tapping me on the shoulder and introducing me to therapy, I don't know where I would be right now. So that step into therapy, along with the other person, taught me that therapy wasn't what was shown on television, wasn't what people and friends told me about. It was actually something that gave me a navigation, or what I call a GPS, to a destination of living a better life, a destination of a healthier life, a destination of understanding my purpose and who I am and what I have to give to the world. So from that, that was early in my entrepreneurial journey. Towards the tail end, my brother lost his best friend, and I'm sitting there confused. You know, my company is now in a position about to get acquired. My brother's living in Ohio, and his best friend just was murdered in the streets of New York. And now I'm on the phone with him, and while he's crying, I'm not thinking of any solutions that can help him because they didn't exist. I knew how hard it was for me to have and find therapy when I began my journey, you know, to find someone that looks like me, to find someone that didn't judge me from the background or experiences or family members that I have, or their choices, for example. It was challenging. So I knew there needed to be a better way for him to get the help that he needed from a distance, living in Ohio and with me being in New York. So in that year, that's when my company True Circle was born, understanding that there's this gap. In the conversations I was having early on doing research about my business, the first gap was, one, myself being a client and knowing others that's looking for help, is that that stigma holds true because what we see on television, typically what we see on directories when we look online or Google for a therapist, are people that don't look like us or can't share the experiences I just shared about my story about Brownsville and growing up. So that makes us step away, including myself, to say, I don't want to go to therapy because I feel as if that understanding is going to be lack of, and I will have to educate them before they probably can provide me help. So I wanted to change that narrative. And with True Circle, we turned around and built a directory with thousands of mental health professionals with not only diverse backgrounds with how you look, but diverse backgrounds in thinking. I share all the time that someone that's addicted to drugs would like to go and see someone that also kicked the habit, because when they're struggling and at their worst, they want to know that that therapist they're speaking with also know what they're going through and how they may feel, and that builds their confidence in treatment. So True Circle was built with that concept, but the goal was using my technology experience, building websites for restaurants and helping them grow their local presence. I recognize in communities that's underserved, mental health professionals that's just starting out in private practice, they're not taught marketing. They're not taught what technology tools to use. They get thrown all these products and information on, use this to manage your clients, use this to video chat, use this to market. And they don't know what to choose all the time. So I recognized there was a void in one part consulting to help them bring them up to speed and help them understand all the moving parts out there. But the most important part is provide technology such as HIPAA compliant and secure video. So when my brother's in Ohio and he needs to see a therapist anywhere in the state of Ohio, or someone licensed for that state, he can jump on a video chat and connect with someone, and they don't have to be within driving distance of him. So that's where we are, and that's why I built True Circle.
Awesome, man. And it's inspiring. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we also thank you for sharing such a personal story. Like you said, most are not willing to be that open about what their personal experience was. And we'll get into many reasons for that, and, you know, different backgrounds, why there's more willingness to share openly versus others. And you've taken obviously a very difficult situation, two specific situations you described with your mother and with your friend, and have used your own skill set to now really make a positive impact. And so, obviously we're at this interesting place right now in society, right? In 2020, most specifically in the US, but around the world. And, some of the questions that I guess we teased a little bit. And so, we, for everyone listening, we haven't discussed this yet. We don't have a game plan yet. There's nothing that Don, Lenny, and I kind of wanted to prepare for, because we wanted this to be very, off the cuff. And so, Lenny, like, your background is very different than mine growing up in New York, than Don's growing up in New Jersey. We didn't grow up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, right? And so, the first topic I wanted to dive into for both of you, and usually the way these have run, like, I throw them to you guys and then I'll try and add something in the end. But like, all right, so we're hearing about, I think we would all agree what we saw with George Floyd specifically was one of the worst things, if not the worst thing we've ever seen on TV, on social media, what have you. So if you're an empathetic person, which I'd like to believe the three of us are, we're affected in that way. A lot of the pushback that we've gotten from some of these talks that we've had is, why did it take that moment for our country to wake up, for you as white people to wake up? Let's be very directly honest about it. Why that moment, right? And so, but what it's led to is it's led to demonstrations, it's led to protests, and in some cases, it's led to, within those protests, then it's led to violence in some cases. Some of that violence, it even can be broken down into other categories. There's the looting and the rioting is one thing. Let's talk about this so that it's not as volatile to what the media is showing us, okay? I think that's the fairest way to look at it. So we're seeing looting and rioting along with the protests. We're seeing the vandalization or taking down of monuments, right, with some of the protests. And we're even seeing more, scary enough, we're seeing more violence, person-on-person violence as well, which you would hope there would be this down period right now, but obviously emotions are high. So I'll start with you, Lenny. Looking at what we're seeing on the news and totally understanding that there is an agenda by CNN, by Fox, right, by polar ends of the spectrum, and those are just two of the players in this.
By the politicians,
yes,
by the advocates, by everyone
by everyone, yes. And I probably was painting too simply there with the with the media bias piece. But so Lenny, like, how do we look at what's going on from a protest standpoint, which I think the three of us would agree is a good thing that's happening? And do we parcel out the violence piece? Is it a part of what's happening with the protest thing? Are these people connected? Are they different? Is it politically driven? I know that's a lot to try and tackle at once, but let's try and dive into that topic.
I think they're excellent question, by the way, and I love that we can have these open discussions to gain understanding, right? Because a lot is lack of understanding or education when it comes to different components involving how people think. If you don't have an understanding, and I look at ignorance as lack of understanding. People don't choose to be ignorant to a fact. You just don't have enough information about it to make an informed decision. So, to answer your question specifically, I think there are different groups of people for different reasons, right?
Okay.
There are people that protest. There are great people that are protesting, from congresswomen that's out there to everyday citizens that live in a community, to pastors, to churches out there protesting and marching. Protest and effectiveness of protesting is to enable and push change. Those folks that are peacefully protesting, unfortunately, as you mentioned, is being shared in different ways. They're being included with rioting. Hey, because of these protests, they're the cause of what's happening with rioting. Now, when it comes to rioting and the other things that's occurring that's more, I don't know the right word, but more involved, should I say, than just peacefully protesting. I think it comes from a concept of, one, and as a society, we're in a space where people don't have the basic necessities they need to live their life day to day. And there are people out there struggling and may find opportunity in looting, right? Because there is time where, hey, I've been locked in, I don't have a stimulus check coming in. All these different things are going on. And there are people out there as opportunists that are struggling and trying to make ends meet or put food on the table in some way. Not justifying, not saying it's okay, but saying that there's
you're just explaining one of the possible reasons why it's happening.
Correct. And then there's a population of people that just feel as if, hey, this doesn't deserve to be here in different ways because, you know, we're going to cause problems make it look like the protesters and other people are doing it. So they may not be Black people. They may not be people chanting a certain phrase or anything. It may just be other people out there. Even a president has gotten on TV and said that at times people are put into these major cities to create chaos. So there's just this muffled message of understanding of what is actually a protest, what's the purpose of the protest, and what is the chaos that follows behind it. And it's grouped together as one when ideally they're all individual pieces and people have different reasonings for why they're pushing those pieces.
I think you nailed it. That's kind of the notes that I took, was kind of like the purpose and the objective. And you mentioned there's a lot of different groups doing it for a lot of different reasons. So the message is muddied, right? No one's sure. Everyone gets looped into one thing, and then you gravitate towards the extremes. So, you know, at first, different things were about awareness. And I've been saying on these things, I think awareness is at a peak right now, right? So what are we trying to achieve through these? What are our expectations? What are our demands as to why we're doing this, right? Is it beyond causing chaos or what have you? And so I really think it does then come down to that people with good intentions have lost control of their message because they don't have that sort of clear point A to point B of, okay, what do I do now that I have people's attention?
I'm agreeing with both of you. I'm shaking my head as both of you are talking. I think, now let's dive a little bit deeper into each of these individual groups within groups, because I think it's fascinating to talk about them. And Lenny, I'll go to you with this because mental health is such a big piece of this. And here's what I mean by that. In fairness, and to your point, you're not justifying certain actions, and the same way I'm not justifying certain actions, but I want people out there to understand that, let's say you're in the looting and rioting category, right? Okay. Yes, we could argue whether that's the right thing to do, whether that's the wrong thing to do right now. The piece that is our society, our country is getting educated on is what we have in the mental health space have understood as intergenerational trauma, right? If there's been slavery for the last 400 years, right, that yes, slavery ended at a certain point, but just like my ancestors with the Holocaust, right, and things get passed down, there's something called epigenetics. Epigenetics is the passing down of trauma from one generation to the next. There's also, you grow up in your neighborhood and your parents have seen certain things, and so they pass down certain biases, or there's implicit biases that are part of it. And so I want to be fair to the people that maybe we're saying look bad in this situation from a looting and rioting perspective. And I'm just using that category as a time being. Lenny, you brought up the opportunity. Well, some of those people are looking at it like the paycheck's not coming in and the system's not working for me. I need to get what I can get. I think another piece of it also, to be fair, is, and it's not just Black people, right? It's white people who are in that category as well. It's people of all colors who are in that category as well. When we see the looting and rioting happen, is when you've dealt with trauma, either that you've inherited or that you're living through, whether it's systematic trauma based on the system, or whether it's trauma that's specific to something that just happened in your life, just during your lifetime, that's situational. It's more difficult to contain your emotions. It's more difficult to contain your anger. It's more difficult to contain your actions. It's exactly why your company is doing what it's doing, Lenny, is because people who don't know to get help or don't know how to find help, part of their reaction and maybe overreaction comes from a place of feeling that trauma. Is that a fair statement to make?
Absolutely. You speak truth in a lot of elements of, the science behind it. You're spot on in the fact that trauma gets passed down from generation to generation. But the unfortunate part is that, there has been outrage for the sake of, when you understand that there's a space in this world that as a Black person, you may not be viewed equal, that frustration boils over at some point, right? Because even if we talk about rioting, it was only segments of what occurred in the last 3 to 4 weeks. There hasn't been a lot or as much rioting as when it first occurred. The first week was horrible and traumatizing for everyone that watched TV during that time. But the concept is spot on in what you're saying, that you get to a point with your trauma and you recognize it, but it's the realization of there's clarity and understanding that the system is flawed for so many more people, even that are Black, and understanding that we have to do and make something change. And sometimes your voice isn't being heard when justice isn't being served. That trauma is going to continue to resurface and be triggers to make you do things to get your voice heard or have a voice.
And Don, I'll transition what Lenny just said to you and want to get your take on this. So like, you look at a beloved figure in our country like a Martin Luther King Jr. And so based on what Lenny just said, you'd have the masses of people who are against looting and rioting pointing and saying, look at the way Martin Luther King Jr. protested in a peaceful protest, even though it was, he pushed the envelope a little bit to make things happen. Why can't everyone peacefully protest that way? If we take it out of this social justice time period right now and we just do a interpersonal relationship thing, we've all gotten into fights where you're saying something to someone, it's getting heated, and then all of a sudden you say something that you can't believe you just said because you're so heated that, and going back to the science of it, Lenny, like your amygdala just takes over, your reptilian brain just takes over, your prefrontal cortex gets hijacked, you're not thinking anymore, and you're just reacting at that point. And there's this buildup. And so, Dom, when you're hearing that from Lenny, who like works in the mental health space, you're hearing me describe that. Does that resonate? Does that make sense if you're putting yourself in the shoes of someone who feels like they've been oppressed for a long time, has heard this from their family members for a long time, and now all of a sudden it's like, bam, we're out in the streets talking about it, we're out in the streets protesting about it. Might it lead more momentum-wise to, again, I'm not painting everyone in the looting and rioting category this way, because I think we would agree there's some people who are just being advantageous, but there are a group of people there that it boils over at a certain point.
I think it should, right? It should, and I understand that, and you can hear my maniac kids screaming. I'm sorry about that.
We can't hear them, actually.
Oh, okay, good. Because I do, because blood. I want to talk about blood boiling. I think that they should, right? And that anger and that frustration, and then that bubbles up. And you're talking about this intergenerational stuff. And I don't think we can compare the civil rights marches in the 60s to now and the leadership that we had, right? Whether it was Dr. Martin Luther King or anyone else, to today, because of the environment, because of the tools and the communication, the accessibility, et cetera. So I think every generation is different. But when you talk about sort of that carrying over from generation to generation, as people are out protesting and being angry, and a lot of that's carryover, how do you end that cycle if you don't have the proper leadership to really channel that energy, channel that passion into something constructive? So if I'm looting, I'm rioting, I'm setting fire, someone's getting hurt, targets being overrun, and then what? and then what comes of that? And I think, you have people that aren't afraid to flame the fires and point and say, this is what's wrong, that's what's wrong. You have other people encouraging certain types of behavior. And again, you were just using that one as an example, so that's why I'm using that one as an example. But then how do you channel that into something productive and better that stops that cycle of helplessness, really?
So I'll jump in if you don't mind, Eric. And
yeah, no, that's what I wanted. Yeah, I wanted to hear your perspective.
Absolutely. To bring two parts to it. So first, as we talked and began the discussion, the last time I answered more intergenerational trauma. Geez, I can't speak to that. Trauma. But essentially, when we speak specifically to rioting, that's essentially what the Boston Tea Party was, right? Like, it was a riot for change, right? And the rioting led to change for them. So there's a space where, rioting now comparable to historical rioting where, we could go down more than the Boston Tea Party, how America and Americans have rioted over time for change outside of Civil Rights Act, outside of there being a change for social justice. So rioting isn't new from a conceptual standpoint, but it's being painted different right now slightly because of the lack of understanding wholly for the purpose, right? So your understanding, as you mentioned, Don, like, hey, where do we go from here? There are agendas, there are conversations in our communities of what steps need to be taken to grow and make change beyond the rioting and protesting. Because my belief as well, it can't stop with protesting, right?
Yeah, I mean, even back to these historical things that you mentioned, Boston Tea Party, again, we know in retrospect, who knows what was going on then, but we know they had a specific objective to sever these ties from, right, the colonial power. So, kind of goes back to that. But what we said with the first question is, we have all these groups, they're all lumped into one. So if certain groups have certain objectives and demands, I don't think they're coming to the surface prominently enough because of all these distracting voices or other voices. And by distracting, I mean, like, purposely trying to take over the conversation for whatever personal gain, a particular group might have, that, these more important things get lost in the shuffle. So I think, yeah, they're protesting, but if you go as far back as that, again, historical perspective, we think we know why they did that. So, being able to sort of lead, articulate, take that next step. Okay, we're riding, but, step two.
All right. One, there is leadership where there is some direction with it. Some of the things that we're requesting are out of our control. And when I say our, meaning a Black community standpoint, where we say, okay, a woman by the name of Breonna Taylor in Kentucky was murdered in her home, sleeping in her bed, and the officers have yet to been arrested, and only one of the 3 officers have been fired. So we're looking for change and action in Kentucky specifically to say, hey, this is what's going on. Someone needs to be, reprimanded for these actions and held accountable for the death of this woman who worked for the city and was sleeping in her bed. And based on a mistake, whether it's a signature or whoever, someone and multiple people need to be accountable, but those that pulled the trigger especially need to be accountable. So that's one cause and fight within itself that we only can wait on time for that to occur. We can ask, we can request.
I mean, there's an example too of again, the political ping pong ball, right? And I think that's pretty messed up too. I mean, I don't know anybody anti-Breonna, like from what you've seen, right? I think across the board, people are calling for justice one way or another. And then at least on the federal level, people call for action. Administration puts out something. People don't feel it goes far enough. But one of the provisions, I think, in this bill that Tim Scott, African-American Republican, South Carolina, put out was banning these no-knock warrants. Wasn't it? I think that was one of the provisions. Democrats say it doesn't go far enough, so they shot the bill down on like a procedural vote yesterday. So now here it goes again, is that there are steps that somebody might take, and now here, and I've said it before, now here come the politicians like making this their ping pong ball, trying to score points. So even when things happen, people call for it, and then people get caught up in partisan politics, and and then nothing gets done.
And so, Don, I heard an interesting interview yesterday with a politician. I won't give the politician's name or affiliation because then it might skew the conversation. But it was a man. I'll give it that. And the politician said, you look at some of what was proposed by a Democratic-run House, and you look at what was proposed by a Republican-run Senate, and even though there was a lot of differences, there was also a lot of similarities. And yet, even in the similarities, they couldn't come to the together and say, hey, look, there's some common ground here, right? And I think, what you're talking about with what, Senator Scott had brought up, with respect to procedure, that was where some of the common ground was. Again, I might be misquoting that. But the sad thing is, and now this kind of plays into this next question, because we've talked about trauma related to some of the folks who might be involved in the violence portion of the protesting, but just not as a Black man, as 2 white men, just as 3 friends talking right now. do we believe, just like we believe that the politicians are playing this ping pong match, right? And the reason likely why they're not agreeing on something right now is because we've got this thing called the pretty big election coming up, you know, in the end of 2020. Is there cause for concern that some of what's happening from a violence perspective is being perpetuated, is being pushed, is being funded, is being helped out by political agendas? That is watering down the messages that we want there to be getting across from the protesting that's being done in a peaceful way. And I'd love to hear both your opinions on that, because again, these are things that we hear. I think we hear very, very, you know, no pun intended, black and white terms when we watch the media. It's like, look at these looters and rioters. These are the protesters that are out there, and they lump them all together, right? And then you see another station, and it's like, look, they're all peacefully protesting. Look at how the cops are going against them and are stopping them from protesting it, right? The answer is not one of those two extremes. I don't believe, at least. The answer is somewhere in the middle. So if we take the violent piece of the protesting going on, and we all agree that there's even pieces within the violence, do we believe that it's politically driven part of it in some way? And if so, how?
You want to start, Don, or you want me to answer?
Yeah, I don't mind. I mean, yeah, that's fine. We can go back and forth. Again, I go back to the passion of the people. I don't think is necessarily politically driven. I don't think the masses are angry, and I think the masses are rightfully angry. I think the peaceful ones are upset and expressing it the way they're expressing it. I think the quote unquote violent ones are equally passionate. I think it's, like you said, when people point to it, when people inflame them for other reasons, I think that's what's happening. I think that the people and the passion of the people is being manipulated, because I really think that, you said it in the beginning, I don't know anybody who looks at the George Floyd video and doesn't see anything horrifically wrong with that. And I don't see anybody that looks at the Breonna case and doesn't see something, you know, wrong with that. So, you know, I think people are generally on one side, and these wedges are being, you know, is it because it's 2020, because it's been an election year? I mean, that's really when it happened last time in 2016, when a lot of these racial tensions were inflamed, and then it died down and then it popped back up. So, but real incidents happen that trigger real emotions from real people, where I think the bulk of them, regardless of race or class, are pretty much on the same side, and then it gets manipulated because God knows why. So that's what frustrates me the most.
The media is showing us images, and I'll transition this to Lenny, but you guys can both answer. This is like the media. Yes, there's absolutely real emotion here, and there's absolutely real reason. I think we've all agreed on that. But then you watch media outlets and you see, look at the bricks of the pallet of bricks that are being dropped in front to help the protesters be violent, right? Like, is that true? Is it not true? Is that the media driving it? Is it not? Like, who would be behind the bricks and stuff? Those are the things that I think need to be discussed.
Those are rabbit holes that I don't want to get lost in, because
okay.
Everything is one big conspiracy to me.
Right.
Okay.
I'll jump in and share that the scope is bigger, and the glass is bigger from, you know, where I sit as a Black man, because, you know, the frustrations come from, you know, the frequency of it occurring and a lack of knowledge of the frequency that occurs. So I think a lot of the expression of frustration, a lot of the protesting, a lot that's been going on is sweeping under the rug the history behind everything that's going on. Let's be frank, like, police were created and police unions were created to catch slaves. Like, that's what police were made. Like, we didn't have police in the country prior to that to stop crime in a similar fashion that we do today. Even if you look at some of the badges, they have it where they have a whip on the badge along with a cowboy with a hat on as well, because their jobs throughout the country as a fraternity was positioned early on through laws to catch slaves, even with the 13th Amendment. You know, and there were points in times that it was legal to burn and watch Black people get burnt, like, as live. So the frustration comes that, you know, even the frustrations that come across that, hey, you know, the violence is going on, the rioting is going on, there's a history of violence and rioting and treatment of other people and inhumane for years. And it wasn't the Black people was on the receiving end. We weren't the ones doing it. So there's a space that the frustration transitions into, hey, there's a lack of understanding of this history. There's a lack of understanding that, yes, you know, I have family members that's police officers and they do their job well and they do it to the best of their ability. But it's about community policing in some spaces where you have a relationship with the community you work in. You're not looking to pull someone over for a broken taillight and to ask them questions that's beyond, you know, just asking them or helping them repair the light or giving them a ticket. So there are spaces in this continuum of racism that, hey, as you mentioned, it died down in 2016 and then you saw a rise back up, but that's from your seat sitting in it. When we wake up every day and I get pulled over or someone I know get pulled over and they call me up and tell me their experience, that's a daily thing that we have to live with and experience.
Well, that was it, and that was in response to Eric talking about the media inflaming things. So I think from a mass perspective is what I was referring to, not an everyday perspective. See, this is what happens. Like intent and
no, but
words
it's good
get.
that we talk this out.
This is why Eric, I'm like,
look, I had a similar conversation with a friend.
But I mean, Lenny, you see, do you understand that too? Like, absolutely, I wasn't saying things died down. I was saying in response to that spike that we see in, you know, he brings
the media
up
and
CNN,
like you said,
Fox, yeah.
The agenda that they're pushing during these times, because if you look at the status of who makes the decisions in the country, most of the bigger decisions, not even most, all of the large decisions made in the country, from the laws to what gets passed and everything, are 90% plus white people that sit on those decision making, what's shown on the media, what news outlets are owned and things of that nature are 90+%. So even the images of Black people aren't represented not only in workspaces, but the media collectively don't represent our population as a whole. It's controlled by others that don't represent us.
So let's take, because we brought up the police thing. Lenny, you mentioned, you know, having some friends in policing. Right after this question, I want to get into the conversation of police, the conversation of campaigns around policing that we've heard. You know, maybe even discussing that topic in terms of the realities, like you're bringing up percentages and stuff like that, getting into percentages and things like that. I before we close the topic on the you know, how you aptly put it, that there are different groups of people within the protesting circles. I want to talk a little bit about what's going, because I think it's a really interesting microcosm, what's happening with some of the vandalization of the monuments and stuff, right? So I'm taking it from a 30,000 foot view perspective, that if I understand that there is gray area, okay, let's call it that, in terms of interpretation of a monument or a statue that's up, right? And then you have these two sides, again, all on one spectrum, all on the other spectrum. You got one side of the spectrum that says that statue has even the slightest bit of something related to slavery in it. There's no reason for that to be up. We should take that down. And then you got another side that says, yeah, but our history of our country was that this is how it was back then. That person still did this, this, and this that helped move our country forward. Are we going to take everything down from everyone who is related to any time in that time period because what was going on at that time period was something related to slavery, which was America's original sin, right? At least that's how, if I had to broadly describe the spectrum, that's how I'd look at them. My hope would be, instead of there being vandalization of you know, these structures and these monuments, there would be conversation about what should stay up, what shouldn't stay up. If we take something down, what should go in its place? Maybe I'm utopian and I believe in a world that can exist. But what I would hope is, and I think it goes a little bit back to what Don's point was, but also what your point was, Lenny, with what you were explaining with the Boston Tea Party and what the objectives are, and you saying that there are leaders, and you're using the Breonna Taylor example as justice being served, right? Or it should be served. Is it like from a violence perspective, is there a way for us to approach everything that's going on with the violence around statues and monuments in a way that would be more collaborative than pulling them down? And maybe that sounds like a leading question, because I'm like, oh yeah, here I'm this guy who's saying like they shouldn't get taken down. I don't mean it in a leading way at all. I just, could you have a circle of people around a monument who won't leave just that circle until their voices are heard of why that monument shouldn't be up there, as opposed to getting cords around it and starting to collectively pull it down. I'll throw that out to both of you. And again, maybe I'm utopian, but I want to always think there's a better way.
No, conceptually, it would make the most sense, right? To do something that is more calm and something that we can discuss and move forward with. But once again, it's back to voices being heard, right? It's not often that two groups of people with differing views can sit in the same space and discuss that comfortably. It's a back and forth that becomes challenging. It's easier when you know each other, like we all are discussing now, but ultimately we get to a place where that communication can lead to further issues, violence even. That has happened in the past in different discussions. So really getting to a place where, we don't pull it down. The folks that's pulling it down wants their voice to be heard. If it's being pulled down in a certain state, there's certain reasons in that state. There's lives that's lost in that state that are Black and brown that people don't speak about every day on social media, or you may not see. So those statements at those times aren't just about the statue. It's saying, whatever has been done, whatever we're affected by at this time, you need to hear our voice. And getting your attention sometimes maybe pulling us down, maybe burning a building down, maybe doing an action to say, okay, do we have your attention yet? And it's not, once again, justifying it, but it's to say people are approaching it from different angles as we're having a discussion.
Don, are you pleading the fifth here?
No, I mean, I get it. Like, I mean, that's it. I mean, like I said, I mean, believe me, I'm more about just sort of empowering people and respecting people and recognizing history and recognizing struggles. I get all that. And not that I disagree with any of that, because like I said, I think what happens is people that disagree with it, right? It gets their attention, but the way that they react to it, and this is their problem, right? Is, again, to dig in and to say, okay, these are people, this is the opposition, right? These people are doing this as an affront to us and to who we are, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, that's, and there's the cycle. So how do you, it's like, damned if you do, you damned if you don't. You get their attention, but is it negative reaction?
It's an interesting time period we live in right now, Don, because I'm going to take what Lenny said, and I'm gonna say I hear you, and then say, because of the time period we're in and how dug into the ground people are on polar sides. So there's definitely an argument to be made that if our voices aren't being heard, well, this is the next logical step so that they can be heard. Sometimes we have to do something that gets our voices heard on a larger platform. I think what Don's point that he's bringing up is, because sides and because of social media and because of media have put people on such far ends of the sides, that we're at an interesting point in our intersection as society, that by protesting in that way through vandalization, you're getting the other side to listen even less now, because they're now pointing the finger back and saying, look, see how bad these people are. They're committing violence. That's why we can't even listen to what they're saying.
And going back to like the Confederate side, right? We won. The North won, right? And for good reason, right? So I get that, and I get why these sides were fighting, and people can say it's over state rights and blah blah blah, but we know what the major issue was. Okay, so the people defending, right, the Confederacy and the Confederate flag, etc., what is their rationale behind that? What is their voice that they want to be heard, right? They say it's because of their heritage, their family members that died in this war, albeit we all, at least on this call, recognize they were on the wrong side of that war. But nobody cares. Nobody wants to hear them. So when these things get pulled down, they take it as a personal offense to them and their relatives and their family. And frankly, because of the side that they were on and what they stood for, do we want to hear it? We don't want to hear, defending slave owners or Confederate, or Confederate generals. I mean, personally, I don't. But therein lies the problem, is that it's not creating dialogue, right? They're feeling like it's a one-sided dialogue, and that they're automatically wrong and on the defensive. And there's that cycle that continues. I mean, I mean, it's almost not statements, it's almost questions. Like, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to solve that. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. But again, if you want to talk about like letting their voices be heard, as soon as the quote other side lets their voices be heard, nobody wants to listen to them anyway.
Well, so look, I don't know that a protester would listen to the three of us, but let's just pretend like we had the platform for protesters to listen to us. Do you start and do you take down a statue because it makes a statement, and because you pick one that's less controversial to take down, right? I don't even know what that is, but let's just go with that as a possibility. And then you make a statement saying, this is what we would want to be up here. This is who we think stands for equality. This is who we think stands for our ideals, as opposed to, because my fear is that what those sides are looking at it as it's just vandalization.
There's no collective ideals in this country. And I think that's a positive thing, but you can't, if you put up MLK, people are going to be offended by that. Which they are. If you put up the founding fathers, people are going to be offended by that, and they are. And again, there's no right or wrong to it, but there is no collective individual that we should idolize that everyone is going to agree and feel comfortable with.
But
and maybe it's accepting that
I appreciate you bringing up the MLK example, because I can't think of a person that you would think there's more widespread acceptance of like, how could anyone not agree? I shouldn't say how could anyone not agree, because everyone has different points of view, but let's say the majority of the population would agree with the way in which MLK went about what he went about and the change that he was looking for. And so
well, look, in the 60s, I mean, the Malcolm X and individuals, like, they had different ways of, not everybody supported the manner by which he went about that. So,
but wouldn't at least voicing your opinion as a group of who you would replace that statue with, as a means of an objective, at least get across a point? Like, you brought up two very different figures, Malcolm X and MLK.
But Eric, I think,
sorry. No, go ahead, buddy.
I think portions of what's happening is beyond discussion, right? This is a portion where we're colliding from agreed. A statue is a figure that, as a community, people can come together and say, let's make a change and do everything else. But in the Black community, we're running out of time, right? Like there's this time space of, what do we have to do to have things change quicker? Because even having a conversation about the statue, and it takes a month, and the town changes the statue, and we all agree on the actual statue, that isn't impacting the real change that's being requested. The change is to say, okay, I have two boys, 7 and 9 years old. When they turn 16 and get their driver's license, that I won't get the phone call one day that something happened to them in the street, right? There's a 12-year-old Tamir Rice playing in the park, shot with no warning, no nothing. The list goes on. And that's the issue with some of elements where we can say, okay, and come up with a conclusion about, statues or figures. But at the end of the day, that time put into that, or that energy put into that, is like, no, we need action and change tomorrow. We need to know someone's going to be held accountable if something happens to our family member, regardless of them being a officer or not. Someone needs to be held accountable. They need to be treated like a criminal the same way. So that's the concept that, is the agenda pushing forward, where it's saying change is not happening quick enough. The statue is a symbolism of the change that hasn't occurred over this time. So now change needs to occur. And this is an example of how we need to continue to share why we need to make a change. Because what was happening then, and that we're celebrating this statue, is still happening today, but the laws are different, the words are different, the nature is different. So, it makes it less seen as slavery, for lack of better terms.
Man, I love what you just said, though. I mean, like the accountability factor, right? Frankly, like the statues bother people, but the statues, like you said, are just symbolism, right? There's day-to-day stuff that you and your family and millions of families around the country worry and deal with. And everyone should be held accountable for whatever action is taken, right? Regardless of who they are, or what they do, or where they're from. I'm 100%. And how could people not get on board with that, right? Even if you can't prevent these things from happening, and God, I hope we work towards doing that, at least knowing when they do happen, that the accountability factor is going to come into play. Like, I mean, that seems like something that everybody could and should get behind.
I would hope, I'll wrap on this one because I do want to get into just the police thing real quickly in the time that we have. Is Lenny, I hear you out, and I'm agreeing with you. My fear is, by the way the media can take that imagery and portray it, the change that you want to have happen quickly, which I want to have happen quickly, which Don wants to have happen quickly, does the other side that wants to use that imagery to not make that change happen or to further their political agenda now say, look at what's happening there. And now we end up getting change even more slowly because of that. And that's where we're living in such an interesting time, because social media just, like, bam, it came into our lives in what, like 2000, what, like 2008, 9, yeah. 2007, right? And then, like, we were, like, as a society, this is wild, wild west right now. Like, it is, because everyone's got opinion, everyone's saying things, and then your feed gets aggregated based on people who have similar ideals to you and stuff like that. And the second you watch someone else's, now you get frustrated, angered. So Lenny, I don't know that we have the answer yet. Let's just say this: we understand why the violence that does happen in a strategic way is happening, because you want your voices to be heard. I should say we want our voices to be heard, even, like, let's collectively say this. We want it to happen sooner rather than later. Don just touched on the point of, I think there's some certain rights and wrongs that we should all be able to agree on. This is a right, this is a wrong, let's right this wrong. And then the final piece of that is, there is still a little bit of a fear that by demonstrating in that way, you're going to have people who look at that because of media and social media that make it even harder for it to happen. So I don't know that I've solved anything.
And let me jump in on that third piece. You know, yeah. There is a piece that on that third piece of saying how the media can portray and flip that. That's not new in the Black community. For us, it's like, all right, that image can be painted all day and say that the people that's protesting and rioting are part of the same agenda and paint us bad, because that isn't new, right? That has been a space where we've known the media to paint. That's why they took the show Cops off of the air, right? Like, there's ways, and I won't get into that based on time, and that the media has been doing this overall. Cartoons, you know, it goes on and on, that we've been painted as criminals. That's been the nature. That's the reason for policing and everything else that we'll get into next. But literally, we've been painted as the enemy in so many different ways, when at the end of the day, we look at it and say, geez, we never stood over bodies while they were burning and smiled and laughed and joked about it. We've never, you know, hung someone from a tree and had a rally and talked about it and laughed and giggled and things of that nature. You know, we've never did the most violent things that this country experienced, but we know in the textbooks and in the media, it's going to represent faces that pull down statues or do these type of things as the most violent people, because you're supposed to be fearful of these people for reasons that most people don't even understand or know why.
I think it's such a gray area on the portrayal, to be honest with you. Like, now, I'm talking about now, because, right, certain people look at that as heroic. And I don't mean black and white. I'm just talking like, those are the good guys and those are the bad guys. And I kind of feel like a lot of people feel like the rioters and protesters and the violent people are the good guys, right? And a lot of people look at them as the bad guys. I think there's such a gray area. You don't even know whose side who is on now and what they're and what they're even fighting for. So it's difficult. I mean, we talk about media, but, you know, again, like, we're going to see, you know, you're going to see Trump putting violent protests in his campaign commercials, and vice versa. You're going to see Biden showing commercials of Trump inflaming people too, right? It's they're all gonna kind of use it. So it's media, it's social media, right? It's the political atmosphere. And again, I think talking and getting back to that commonality and really common sense, it's like we got to stop putting our faith in bullshit, like whether they're people, false gods, and media, and just like think for yourself and do the freaking right thing.
That's what I'm hoping comes from these conversations. Look, the people that we can impact, we can't impact based on our platforms, many millions of people, but the thousands of people we can get to on our platforms, that to me is what comes out of this. So even if we don't have like definitively, Lenny, back to that last conversation as we transition into the police portion, is even if we don't have like this is going to solve all, what these conversations do is that they at least let everyone hear the different perspectives that the actions, the ideologies come from, so that it helps people make informed decisions as to what is right and wrong, as opposed to allowing the media. And I'm not saying that like we go out of our way to allow the media, but I think the media is present in our life. The media is present in our feed. It's hard to escape it. Let's be honest. Like if you're living on this planet, it's hard to escape it. All right, so want to get into this next topic here because I think it's a really important one, and maybe we don't have to go as deep on this one because we're going to keep having these more, Lenny. But you know, in the interest of time, but like, okay, so we're obviously we've got this contention point where you talked about it a lot in the media. You talked a lot about it over the course history of time. You talked about it, the history of where policing started from, right? And there's this contentiousness, right, that exists with police officers, right, with the Black community, that it's hard to ignore, right? And so the challenge, again, I speak very transparently, so hopefully this is okay. The hard thing, being a white person who hasn't had, using the term, a whole nother segment we'll talk about on privilege and stuff like that, the terminology, all that stuff, but let's just, for the purpose of this, call it privilege, hasn't had to deal with that directly, is I look at it from a logical standpoint, just logic, and I say, okay, there's likely more instances of police on Black crime. We see it more. At the same time, the logic in me says it's impossible for an entire system, an entire group of people to be completely corrupt. That to me, that is just only logic, right? That's not, and so where now I think we've been describing things in extremes, right? You've got the people who say, no, every police officer is great. There is no such thing as racism in policing. You know, we don't need to change anything. And then there's groups of people who say, you know, and I won't even use the campaigns yet because we'll quickly get into the campaigns, but who say the whole system of policing is corrupt. It started in a corrupt place. We need to blow it up and change it up all over again. So, you know, Lenny, you have a very different perspective than in terms of where you grew up, how you grew up, the relationship of your friends, your family members to policing. Can you give a little bit of that perspective for us?
Absolutely. You know, growing up in Brooklyn, just in general, you grow up, you know, police are trouble at the end of the day. They're there to cause more harm than good in most cases, you know. Not saying the police aren't ever called, not saying they don't ever show up because certain injuries, the ambulance is called, or certain things happen, police are there as well. But the key behind it is that I grew up in the 90s where stop and frisk was big in New York City, you know, like literally, you know, we call them Ds for the detectives, and literally you could be walking down the block, they pull you over and they're searching you. And some of them will let you go. And they'll tell you, we're only looking for drugs and guns today, you know, and if you don't have drugs and guns on you, they leave you alone. You could even have a beer, for example, and they won't give you a ticket for it. So there's a space where it's saying, we don't talk about, you know, crime in the sense that, you know, 88% of people, of white people crimes are against other white people, right? It's considered Black on Black crime most of the time because we look, and once again, the media paints it, society paints it as these inner cities and places are in a space where, you know, crime is happening the most. But then when you aggregate it and put police there, Black people are only 13% of the population. And you take that percentage compared to the amount of Black people killed by police, it's much higher than other cultures when you look out there. So that's where we say the system is corrupt, because how we disproportionately recognize with killings by police, imprisonment by police officers, and the life that we go through is tagged to the police system in such a way that how can we trust them? So growing up in that space, the trust is lost in the fact that they've done more harm to our family and our community than good in a lot of cases. Not saying that their presence hasn't helped when I said crack was put in, but there's documentation out there that talks about the CIA putting crack into the inner cities to, you know, fund the drug war. So there's so many different things and elements when we say as a society, you take a war on drugs and lock up Black people, but as a country, you understood that these communities, you're giving them harsher penalties. So growing up in that society, growing up in the 80s and 90s during that crack epidemic, recognizing people are getting 10, 20 years where crack cocaine, you get harder penalties than cocaine in other neighborhoods, is where we turn around and say the system as a whole, it's the judicial system, not just policing. It's saying from the court system top down, the system is broken. So if they're led and the same system is ran under the same umbrella, it's not saying, oh, the police alone are corrupt and they're the ones doing the bad jobs. If you structure a system and write laws and do things that oppress other people, that's how the system is broken.
And to give some color on what you're bringing, I know this isn't the macro point that you were making, but to give some color on what you were talking about, Lenny, with crack versus cocaine, just so for folks out there who don't understand, I had to get educated on this because I'm not a drug user, so I didn't know these things before, is coke and crack come from the same cocoa plant, right? And so it's the way in which the drug is made, right? And then the crack drug is more affordable, was distributed out into underserved communities, more communities of color, and so the crimes and what was given out in terms of punishments based on the crimes were disproportionately higher than the crimes that were based on coke, which were being seen in more affluent communities. Did I paraphrase that correctly?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. So what I want to clarify with the first point that you were making is when you say the way that we see the cops, right? When you were saying we, were you referring to like me and my friends growing up in Brownsville and how we felt about it? Are you talking about the communities of color in general around the whole country? Is it fair for you to talk about? And hopefully that's not a volatile question. Is it fair for you to talk about communities of color in general? Because again, not growing up having felt that way towards cops, it's very interesting to hear the perspective of like, oh, here they are. They're just like, is the whole perspective, they're just here to cause trouble. They're not here to help?
There's different perspectives, and I can speak because I grew up in three of the toughest neighborhoods in New York and New Jersey. You know, I was born in Far Rockaway, Queens, which is, you know, crime-wise is high. I was raised in Brownsville, Brooklyn, where both my grandparents and parents were raised as well. And then I lived in Irvington, New Jersey, right outside of Newark, New Jersey, for a stretch of time. So that was my first 14 years of my life was in those three neighborhoods. So I could speak to those neighborhoods collectively. I won't speak for the whole country, but collectively in those three neighborhoods, they were all similar, you know, and how we viewed the police growing up, what we had to deal with, how we had to be prepared in dealing with them, being afraid or running from them because of the fact. And when I say there's a separation in New York City, the way the task force was, which they kind of are dismantling now, the undercovers is what we call the DTs. You had your plainclothes cops, and those were more of the people we knew that can cause trouble. Those were the ones that rough you up, throw you on a fence, and handle you, and you wouldn't understand why half the time. The blue and whites wasn't as the same because those were seen as kind of the ones that ticket you. They typically were rookies, especially in our neighborhoods, to get more people in there. So it wasn't a lot of fear for those guys because, you know, they would just write tickets for the most part. But the detectives that's looking for drugs and narcotics, yeah, they were seen as trouble.
Got it. Don.
I got nothing to add, man. I mean, I will never.
Growing up in the neighborhoods that we did, where that wasn't prevalent, like when you hear something.
I wasn't in a great neighborhood, but I didn't have the same fears and worries that he's going to have, and I know that, and I recognize that. So, it's tough. I guess the question I have, and I don't want to make assumptions about sort of crime in those places too. And I think you mentioned earlier about like community policing and stuff. I mean, in those times in the 80s and 90s, when you were growing up, I mean, would that have been a good viable alternative?
Absolutely. I think before crack went into the inner cities, policing was slightly different. Not that it was perfect or that we didn't have these issues, because once again, I grew up in Brooklyn where Amadou Diallo was a person unarmed that was killed. Yusef Hawkins was killed in Howard Beach by a gang of people that were acquitted as well. Well, no, they were actually paid for their crimes. But, you know, in that space, when crack hit, that changed the dynamic of crime. The tilt just, you know, spilt over. It was just something that any neighborhood couldn't control or handle. But prior to that, you had your local people raise each other. People looked out for each other. People, you know, grandparents knew each other and parents knew each other. So it wasn't just policing outside, but it was just a sense of community in a different way. And then once drugs came, that sense of community broken up, because now you have, you know, fathers out of the home, mothers working 2 jobs, you know, people passing away and dying. So grandparents are raising their grandchildren. So that dynamic in itself created a new wave of inner city life that can now, quote unquote, be looked at as high crime rate. We need more policing because of these issues, when it stemmed from purposely being put there and caused to be that way.
That's extremely helpful, and I, you know, I think where back to this whole, you know, different sides of the fence and digging heels in, you know, what you've seen come out now from a campaign perspective is hashtag defund the police, right, campaign. And I think the interpretation of words that are used, right, wrong, or indifferent, oftentimes they mean different things to different people. So what it does is it creates an angst that people feel on all angles of this, based on not understanding what the verbiage means. And you know, I'm close with Shamika Holtzclaw, the WNBA player. She put something up the other day. This I did read to Don before we got on this call. It was something like, we said defund the police. We didn't say take away all the money from the police and get rid of policing. What we said was reallocation of funds towards more mental health programming, towards this type of program, stuff like that. Which is similar in a way to me when I've seen signs of like, we didn't say only Black Lives Matter. We said Black Lives Matter. We need your help right now because for a long time we don't believe Black Lives Matter, right? So oftentimes what gets lost in translation is when we try and be very short with a hashtag. You know, this is why hashtags are so difficult. The words that are used and how they're interpreted and how they're understood, different things to different people, right? And so I would hope that there's not a police officer in this country who, other than being sociopathic, and I don't mean that like about police specifically, I just mean that about how any of us deal with watching things. Any police officer with the slightest bit of empathy who watched what happened with the Floyd murder, right? Who watched what happened in Central Park with the gentleman's color being used against him as the calls being made, would say changes should be made. Look, that's what I would hope, right? And so the difference between changes and reallocation versus the terminology of defunding, right? I think that's where people get caught up and say, what do you mean? And then, like, you know, I'm guilty of watching media on both sides because I want to get the perspective. I want to hear the different extremes and come to some middle ground in my own mind saying, what's the real story here? And you hear the media that's on the right and they hear defund police and they say, who are you going to call when there's a crime? How are you going to get someone to come and help you? Like, okay, we're just going to get rid of police completely. Can we have like a little bit of discussion about what actually is thought of when we hear the term defund police? My understanding, at least from, again, Shamika and friends I've spoken with, is how do we strategically go about the allocation of funds to the right places and not actually take policing away completely?
Absolutely. Great question. I think there's two perspectives to it that I'll share. The first perspective is using the term and understanding defunding, as you mentioned. Being a mental health expert as yourself, you understand even mental health issues stem from areas in your life that you may not have control over. If your employment is off, you may have mental health challenges, and no matter how much treatment you get, no one can fix you being unemployed necessarily to overcome that challenge. If you have a food crisis or a housing crisis in a similar fashion, that can impact your mental health. And until those things are fixed, you can't move forward. So in that same respect, when we say defunding, is saying, okay, like a gentleman like Rayshard Brooks. Rayshard was in a situation where, okay, he was trying to get home. The officer spoke with him for 45 minutes to an hour, if not longer. And at some point, they should have been in a space of, hey, we should take this man home. That's what we're saying. A different type of officer, not a badge and a gun, should have showed up to that situation. So defunding is saying the milking of the overtime, the same cops on all the shifts and working all of these hours, the same cops without diverse thinking and mindsets may be in a space where, you know, if you had money towards social services, or you had money towards housing, or you had money towards homelessness and all these other areas, these things will solve some of the issues that we're policing out there and charging people for. You know, I grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn. There was a point in the 90s that in Brooklyn, you would get a ticket if you rode a bike on the sidewalk. Like, you wouldn't go to other neighborhoods and have that issue. Like, I can get a ticket by riding a bike on the sidewalk because that's the law out here. But you go any other town, Queens or somewhere else, you don't have that issue. So the concept of defunding, you hit it spot on, is saying there are other tools that people and communities need, that if funding went there, because New York City does over $500 million a year in police funding, and the next in line is just over $100 million for hospitals and healthcare, that $400 million or $300 million and change gap is a big gap that can be split up into multiple services to help out, whether it's $100 million, $200 million, $300 million out of their 500. You know, we're searching for PPE material for our doctors and ERs, but yet if anything happens and we're looking at some of the riots that people are peacefully protesting, the police are in riot gear with shields, masks, vests, all types of equipment with peaceful protesters, but we can't get people on the front lines with the coronavirus with the right equipment in the hospital to save a life. So that's the first perspective I'll give. And I have a second one, but I'll let you chime in off that.
No, Don, do you have something to say there? Because I've got, no, you're good. Don's like, don't get me in on these more sensitive ones.
No, I mean, it's not even sensitive. I think that, look, identify what the problem is and then figure out what the solution is. And you know, it's not that hard, but yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, there are problems. We know there's problems.
But Don, when you say identify and then solution, so here's where I'll throw back to Lenny, where the reallocation of funds, okay, when you gave a great, and I'm only using your data, right? Because I don't know the data, but you gave a great example of there's 500 million going towards this. The next is 100 million going towards that. That gap of 400 million, where else could that be used? So let me come in with a
here's
slight
the other problem is
angle.
Just throwing money at things does not equate to a solution either.
Well, and this is where I'm getting at. And so let me go with this angle. Like, and Lenny, I think you know me enough to know that I'm not advocating for my own services to get used more, okay? But I'll use the services that I do. Is one of our programs is called Same Here Service, right? It's meant for servicemen and women and first responders. Outside of social justice issues, I can tell you from working with NYPD that the understanding of what mental health is, what trauma is, how it builds up inside of us, isn't understood by the masses in policing. And by the way, that's not an indictment on the police. That's an indictment on our society. Our society hasn't been taught those things, right? So my point there is, okay, in terms of reallocation, well, maybe the money doesn't go away from the police, but some of the money is used towards you're bringing in professionals so that they understand, what does trauma in the Black community look like? What does your own trauma as police officers look like? How does that trauma, how is it used in bias when you are policing in a neighborhood? How's it in bias when you two are interacting, a white officer and a Black individual on the streets like you were in Brownville, Brooklyn? So my only take there is, and I know Don from a timing perspective, we got to wrap up in a little bit, is the defunding term, in someone from an ignorant standpoint from the outside would look at that and say, okay, so we're just going to get rid of cops, right? That would be one end of the extreme. No, we're not saying that. But some people internalize that way. Let's be clear in that we're not saying that. The other people who would say it's a reallocation to different places, I just want us to be open to the idea that maybe giving more resources, not from the standpoint of salaries,
Right.
not from the standpoint of vacation days and paid time off and stuff like that, but from the standpoint of creating more and more programs to bridge gaps, to do exactly what Same Here is meant to do. And again, not for a plug, but for the purposes of helping society understand this, is that we need to come together and understand each other better. I just learned so much by hearing what it was like growing up in Brownsville. Not saying that I was this ignorant fool before that didn't know any of that, but it's so helpful to hear it every time I hear it from someone who's grown up in a different environment than I've grown up in. Don, you seem like you were.
Yeah, no, I think it was on CBS Sunday Morning this week where they had an officer, and I think he was head of one of the unions, but was very frank and candid. And he's like, 90% of what we do is social service calls, right? That's what we're being brought out there for. Not crime, not violent, not, right? It's domestic issues or community issues, stuff like that. And, just allowing the budget and the training, to your point, to reflect that and those skill sets that are needed to deal with the actual situations that they deal with on a daily basis. So I was just kind of agreeing with it. I'll look for the link. It was a really good eye-opening program where it's somebody in a position with a voice, with authority, and speaking very candidly of like, this is what we actually deal with on a day-to-day basis. Like, let's not put that money into militarized weaponry. Like, let's put it into helping people deal with whether it's mental health or, other social issues that they get calls on the regular.
And let me jump in and share with you as well that the requirements to become a police officer comparable to other professions is, lower than most from an education standpoint, right? Not saying that they're not smart. I have friends that graduated college and became officers as well. But a lot of the force, you go to academy for 3 to 6 months, if that. You guys may know better than I do, but that's it. And you're being trained for combat. You're not being trained to deal with people necessarily, right? So as you mentioned, and to your point, Eric, there's a lack of knowledge coming out because they're not educated on dealing with people where social worker have to get their clinical hours in and work with clients and work underneath someone prior to going out on their own. These are things, even as a doctor, doing your residency and doing some work and doing some surgeries prior to really doing it by yourself. There is a low bar for some of the processes where we're not holding them accountable to their knowledge as much as we should. They can be more knowledgeable in so many other spaces and when to and how to handle certain situations and know when to call the other people in that can actually do the help.
It's such a good point, and I so appreciate it. I'll wrap that last point up and then wrap our whole conversation up by saying this is I think within the space of giving people understanding of mental health, there's this interesting debate going on of, do we allocate the funds towards having mental health professionals go along on some of those calls or go instead on some of those calls? I don't know if I would necessarily advocate for that, only because I still think underneath all of it, we've got this issue, which is, if we're going to have police officers, which I believe we're going to have, let's give them also the bottom line understanding of what trauma is, their own trauma and trauma of people that they're helping out in the streets. I think that's such an important piece. Even if you give mental health professionals the sitting in the car with them or going on the calls with them. So amazing last hour and 15 minutes. Like it was, I love these conversations. I even though Don and I might get frustrated with each other sometimes in a good way, in a loving way, because it's like, what is going to come from this? What problems are we going to solve? Lenny, I think you'd agree that the only problems we're going to solve is that we're going to be able to talk about them openly. And if we have more educated populace that gets the main issues, they can make informed decisions that will move us forward in the right way. That right now we're relying on bits and pieces of media headlines and stuff that aren't necessarily moving us in the right direction.
Absolutely.
So, awesome, guys. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate everyone who tuned in. And then I really appreciate my buddy Lenny, my buddy Don, And we'll have episode 4 coming up next week.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.